My third year at Eckerd, I finally got the opportunity I've been waiting for. I got to do my own research. I was so stoked. My advisor had this project idea, studying fiddler crabs. Now, fiddler crabs are these little crabs. They're about yay big. And the males have these really big claws, and they dig these deep little burrows, and then they fight over the girls to, who has the better burrow gets the best lady, and it's all very romantic. And this activity had been shown to help Spartina grasses grow up north. And my advisor thought, hey, well, in Florida, mangroves tend to take the role of Spartina grasses in the ecosystem a lot. So I wonder if the fiddler crabs do the same sort of facilitation for mangroves. She had lined up this beautiful research site called Cockroach Bay, though, come to think of it, there weren't really cockroaches there, so I'm not sure why it was called that. But anyway, it was once a shell mining pit, but the state had bought it, and they had filled it back in, and they had turned it into a nice wetland. And just about 6 months before I got there, they had filled it back, they had connected it back to Tampa Bay. So it had just started getting water flow, and of course it had just started getting mangroves, which was so perfect, because all over there were these little tiny seedlings that were exactly what I needed to have for my site. And my field site was this long stretch of beach that was covered in fiddler crabs and had all these little baby mangroves that had just started recruiting. And to do my experiment, I had to create these conditions where there would be crabs and where there wouldn't be crabs, and see if there was any difference between mangrove growth in the two of them. So to create areas where there weren't crabs on a stretch of beach covered in crabs, I created these cage-like enclosures. They didn't have a top, but they were 3 feet by 3 feet, and they had really mesh sides. There was really thin mesh so that the baby crabs couldn't get in. And they were about 1.5 feet tall, and about half of that had to be buried into the ground so that they couldn't burrow under it. And I had 15 to do. And my first day of field work, I had 15 cages and an empty beach. And I was really not that excited. Because I knew I was just going to have to dig. And on that day, I learned that there are 2 major hazards to working in Florida. The first is the weather. Starting at 7 a.m., I got my little crappy garden tools and I started trying to dig to put these cages in. And it was awful. The sand was very rocky and really coarse, and these garden tools were crap. So I ended up having to dig with my hands anyway, and I'm digging and I'm digging, and all of a sudden it starts to get hot. And I'm digging and I'm digging, and it's getting hot. Now, when I say hot, I mean, I live in Hawaii, okay? I like hot weather. It was hot. It was unbelievably hot. I got up to 95 that day. And in Florida, it's like a sauna. It is so humid, you can barely breathe. So I kind of ended up having to get in the zone of digging, where I'm just digging and digging and digging. And I'm digging and digging and digging. And it's like the world does not exist. I am digging. All I'm doing is digging. I'm digging and digging and digging and digging. And finally, I kind of wake up from it, and I look at my watch, and it's about noon. And I am covered in sweat, and my hands are bloody, and I'm like, okay, you know what, fine. It's time for a break. And it's at that time that I learned there's a second hazard to working in Florida. As I stood up from my cage that I was digging, I turned around, and there was a gator. And when I say gator, I don't mean a gator, or a gator, or a gator. I mean a 15-foot alligator. It was twice the size I was. Now, okay, don't get me wrong. I've seen gators before. I've been in Florida for 3 years. You see gators when you're in Florida. They're just there. I mean, by ponds, by lakes, by rivers, anything with water, there's gators. But usually gators are 30, 40 feet away from you. And, I haven't really ventured any closer than that before. So, being 5 feet away from a 15-foot gator, it kind of freaked me out. And I started to panic, and I stood there, and I started to envision all these news articles I'd read about gators eating little dogs or tearing the limbs off of small children. And I was panicking, and I stood there for about a minute and a half, completely struck and unable to do a thing. And then at that point, I kind of realized that it had been about a minute and a half, and nothing had happened. And I looked down, and no, don't worry, the gator was still there. But he seemed kind of comfortable. And I kind of thought about it, and I'm like, okay, if I'm standing here for a minute and a half and he hasn't moved, maybe he's not all that interested in me after all. And so I started breathing again, which was nice. And I stood there for about another minute because I still hadn't quite gotten the feeling back into my legs. And then I decided, okay, Christy, you can do this. And I backed away slowly. And I got into my car and I shut the door and I stared. And I swear, throughout the whole ordeal, about 20 minutes, that gator didn't move one frickin' muscle. He couldn't have cared less that I was there. But me, being me, was totally freaked out. And then once I had kindly calmed down from being freaked out, I realized that there was a 15-foot gator covering the rest of my field site. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to put in all my cages that day. But I did get a good story out of it all, which I guess is nice. Unfortunately, I didn't have a camera. And that is my one regret to this day, because let me tell you, the picture of that gator that I could have gotten right then would have been awesome. Oh well. Anyway, that's what happens when you work in Florida in the summer in the field. You get hot, and you see gators. Let that be a lesson to anyone who thinks about doing field research in Florida. And that is my story. I hope you liked it.